Well, we're back, Whiskey Politics, for the Ricochet podcast. Dave Sussman here, and I'm very happy to have with us senior writer for the Weekly Standard, Stephen Hayes. Stephen Hayes is an author and a regular panelist for Bret Baier's Special Report. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure. Good to be here.
Pleased to have you. Before we get started, I want to discuss something that actually I heard from you this summer on a Ricochet podcast with the good folks on the flagship. You were talking about from the perspective of being what people would consider a never Trumper, if you will, that one of the justifications for that was that you really just couldn't come to terms with explaining to your children how you could support a man after all the things that he has said and done. Obviously, we're now post-election. What have you since said to your children?
That's a very good question, actually. I mean, just for a little bit of background, this came up with my kids. My kids are 11, 9, 6, and we've got one on the way. And my kids ask me about this pretty regularly. I think in part because Trump would sometimes attack me from the stump, part because they would hear things at school, talk to kids on the playground. And my son asked me about this, and we had a long talk in particular about Trump mocking the New York Times reporter with disabilities. And my son's question at the end of my explanation as to what Trump had done was, why would anybody do that, Dad? That was a very good question. And I walked them through sort of why I wouldn't support Trump. After the election, we have talked about this. And I've said people were willing to look past a lot of the things that we saw about Donald Trump, in part because they were so frustrated with where we are as a country, with what they've seen from Washington, and in particular what they saw from the other candidate. I mean, they were looking at Hillary Clinton as somebody who has a long history of saying things that aren't true. Certainly the email scandal, I would say, and her inability or unwillingness to tell the truth about what she had done, that really mattered. So the way I tried to frame it with my kids was, Donald Trump has done some bad things. I'm not changing my mind about what Donald Trump has done, and I'm not going to justify it. People chose Hillary Clinton or chose Donald Trump because they thought Hillary Clinton was in many ways worse. Donald Trump is now the president-elect. We all need to hope that he does well. It's important for the country that the president do well. If Hillary Clinton had been elected, I would want her to do well. I wouldn't want a lot of her policies, but I'd want her to do well for the sake of the country. So that's where we are. My job as a writer at the Weekly Standard will be to cover Trump fairly, thoroughly, to scrutinize the decisions he makes, to describe them accurately, praise them when I think he's made good decisions, and criticize him when I think he's made bad decisions.
Well, let's move over to some of those policies, and obviously we're about a month after the election here. I want to start off with the economy, and one of the things that we obviously all agree on from a right-of-center perspective is free markets. And when it comes to the economy, we're talking about decisions that are going to be implemented and made. We've already seen one right now with the carrier deal.
Right.
How, from the standpoint of being a free market advocate, which I've read obviously a lot of your work, you take a look at what many people consider cronyism, but just for us.
Right. And that's what it is. I mean, I think that is what it is. Look, as a political move, I think it was a smart move for Donald Trump. He'd made this case repeatedly, sort of the broad case against free trade throughout his campaign. At one point he said, if I'm elected, we will, quote, throw free trade out the window. So he was blunt about it. I mean, at other times he said he embraced free trade, but I mean, he basically was running on trade. It was one of his signature issues. And he talked specifically and repeatedly about carrier. So from a political perspective, what Trump did, I think, was smart. It's in line with what people thought of Donald Trump when they watched him on The Apprentice. Even though that was a makeup show and he could, they staged things and he could do what he wanted to get the results. If somebody didn't produce the results that Donald Trump wanted on The Apprentice, they were gone. And Donald Trump demanded immediate results. He wanted to show people that he could get stuff done. That's what Carrier says to voters. It worries me. I do think it's crony capitalism. It's not a good way to do business. It's true that this kind of thing happens a lot, so it's not as exceptional as I think some critics have made it seem. But just because it's common doesn't mean it's good. And my concern actually goes to the premise of your question, which is those of us on the center right all believe in free markets. I'm worried that's no longer the case. Mike Pence, in an interview with the New York Times, said, we've tried the free market and America's turned out the loser. That's Mike Pence. He's been a pretty big defender of free markets, an advocate for free markets. And you've got him saying something like that as Donald Trump's running mate now, vice president-elect. Who will be the defenders in the White House of free trade and free markets?
And on the opposite end, you had Bernie Sanders going against hype.
Right.
Which is incredible. So you've got these different role reversals now
that
are happening. So it's an interesting, and so obviously from your perspective, you're going to be watching that closely over the coming years. You recently had an article, and it was about President Obama, and you basically labeled him as a failed president, primarily for three things. Number one, Obamacare. Number two, one of the worst economic recoveries. No matter what the unemployment rate says, it's worker participation index counts as well, and the Iran deal. Going into a Trump administration, of those three, which do you think should be attacked first and resurrected or remedied?
That's a very good question too. I mean, we'll start with the economy because I think it picks up from where we left off. Trump has an opportunity to really make headway on the economy, to have real economic growth, and to have it soon if he cuts taxes and does the things that we all know that have been shown over time to produce those results. I think protectionism has the potential to move us in the wrong direction on that. I mean,
economically,
yeah. And my concern would be the message that he's sending by doing things like carrier will scare businesses. I mean, he sent out a series of tweets and said, if a business wants to fire employees or move operations out of the country, we'll impose a 35% tax on anything they want to bring back in as retribution. That was the word that Donald Trump.
Right.
I mean, that scares me. I know it scares businesses. And isn't the incentive then for businesses to not come to the United States in the first place? If you're going to start a business, start it outside where you're not going to be subject to the tax or you're not going to be subject to those restrictions. I think it incentivizes the wrong behavior in many cases. So he could do the economy. I don't think he will do the economy. Obamacare is an obvious place to start. Republicans can repeal Obamacare through reconciliation, which requires 51 votes. They can't replace Obamacare with reconciliation. That's the problem. That's the challenge. I think what Republicans are likely to do, if Trump will go along with what I think leading members of Congress want to do, is work to repeal Obamacare and to do it pretty quickly. And then move to replace Obamacare by actually presenting a plan as legislation and pressuring Democrat senators in particular to support it. The advantage Republicans have, it's a risky maneuver, and you can imagine the media coverage of people whose insurance is up in the air or who have the potential to be kicked off of Medicaid or what have you, will be, I will just predict, go way out on a limb, there will be a lot more media scrutiny of those people than there was of the people who lost their insurance due to the implementation of Obamacare.
Right.
But I think what Republicans want to do is pressure in particular senators in states that Trump won who are up in 2018. And there are a number of them in states that Trump not only won, but won with significant margins. And say to them, look, Obamacare hasn't worked. It's failing. It's collapsing around us. We can't fix it the way that it is. We've got to sort of start from scratch and see how many of those Democrats they can pick off.
And obviously, the leverage of 2018 is something that the Republicans have in their favor. There's
Huge.
more Democrats.
If my numbers are correct, I think Democrats are defending 25 seats.
Right.
Republicans are defending 8. And as I say, many of those Democratic seats are in states where Donald Trump did well.
Mm-hmm. So Obamacare would be your primary first,
Probably.
with the economic principles that it looks like it's going to be more protectionism.
Yeah.
I mean,
I think there are other things. I mean, I think there are other things Trump can do right away to have a pretty significant impact on the direction of the country, and also send the kind of signals that I think he wants to send. That
right.
I'm an outsider. Iran is an outsider. I'm going to do things differently. Coming in and undoing the regulations that Barack Obama has implemented over his 8 years in office would be huge. Now, some of those regulations were crafted in such a way that it will take a long time to unravel them. but doing everything he can immediately to send a message, we're not going to be doing this way, would be helpful.
You go back talking about Obamacare and how the media will portray those individuals that lost their insurance compared to those that lost their doctor and are paying ridiculous premiums now. New York Times, you just talked about this week here at the Weekly Standard Cruise, have implemented a new policy of calling politicians on their lies. Mm-hmm. Okay, which obviously is insane from that standpoint. You are looking at a new media landscape today. Trump is now going to be the target of every potential media investigation, unlike we've seen in 8 years. What are your opinions from the standpoint of where the media has been and what we're expecting to see now with Trump in office?
Well, I mean, we're already seeing it. We're a month into the sort of post-election period, and the scrutiny on Trump is unlike anything we've ever seen. There's a presumption that he will do harm, that the things he's saying aren't true, and that he deserves to be scrutinized like nobody's ever been scrutinized before. Look, as you say, I was not for Trump. I didn't vote for Trump. I was skeptical of Trump throughout much of the campaign. I made it my business to fact check Trump as often as I could. When he said things that were wrong, I called him on it. When he said things that were crazy, I said they were crazy. When he lied, I said they were lies. So I think the New York Times is right, actually, to have this policy of calling politicians on their lies. Mm-hmm. The problem is, the New York Times is acting like this is the first time this has happened. It's like they're having an institutional epiphany. Politicians lie sometimes. And the reality is, of course, we can go back and look at dozens of things that Barack Obama has said as President of the United States that deserved that same scrutiny, arguably deserved more scrutiny because he was in office. I'm thinking of things like an interview that he gave to Yahoo News. This is beginning of this year, end of last year. He was asked about Guantanamo and the population there, and the president said something to the effect of, there are only a handful of recidivists, or we always knew that there would be a handful of recidivists. There weren't a handful of recidivists. There were 196 recidivists when the president made that comment. He had gotten a report from his director of national intelligence detailing the recidivism rate. So the president of the United States lied. He didn't get called on it. In the same interview, the president said, we've released some low-level individuals. They've released people who were bodyguards for Osama bin Laden. They've released senior Taliban officials. They've released people who have run other al-Qaeda affiliates. These were not low-level individuals. They've released people of all ranks in al-Qaeda.
Right.
The media didn't even report that, much less scrutinize him or fact-check him or call it a lie. The problem, I think, and this is where I think the mainstream media is having, will have a real difficulties. So many conservatives have checked out. They just say, we recognize this double standard. You didn't do this with President Obama, what you're doing with Donald Trump. And they ought to have been doing it for both.
Right. Well, you raise an interesting side issue that I'd like to go into very briefly here for the remaining time that we have. You've considered yourself and you've called yourself somebody that has an quote-unquote unhealthy obsession with the bin Laden documents, right? Going back to 2011 at the compound where they found these documents, and how come they have not been released? This has opened the door to you to be introduced to the new Secretary of Defense, Jim Mad Dog Mattis. Talk to us about your perspective on him and what we see for obviously some national security issues that are obviously front and center right now.
Well, my view on Mattis is that I'm not sure that there is a single individual who would do a better job or is better qualified to be the next Secretary of Defense. I mean, it's an outstanding pick that Trump made. There's so many things to say about Mattis. He's known as the warrior monk because of his belief in reading. He hasn't owned a television for years, which, despite the fact that I work in television, says something about his voracious reading habits. Mm-hmm. He wrote a terrific letter. You can Google it and find it. Went viral to a young officer, I think it was 2003 and 2004, on the reasons to read so that you can learn from other people's experience and don't have to experience everything as if it's happening for the first time. So he's an intellectual, but he's also a badass, if I can say that, right? I can say that.
That's another way for saying Mad Dog,
it's
right?
It's a podcast, right? He's a badass. I mean, you can also look up Mattis quotes and the things that he said to our enemies, to warn them, to our friends, to warn them to be good friends. Pretty terrific. And he's also got a softer side, and you know, earlier here on the Weekly Standard Cruise, I told a story that had been told to me some years ago and is on an off-the-record basis and has subsequently been told publicly, so I feel like I can share it, about a cross-country trip that Mattis took, where he drove across the country visiting the families of Marines who had been killed under his command, and made it a long trip. Bill Kristol says it was a 2.5-week trip, and went out of his way to visit as many of these families as he possibly could. He didn't have to do that. It's important that he did it. I think it says a lot about who he is.
Yeah, you need to know those individuals personally.
Right, in many cases.
Last question, and it actually comes from a Ricochet member. His name is Spiral, and he says, several Republican senators won't support using the so-called nuclear option. We're talking about Lindsey Graham, Jeff Flake, Pat Roberts. Will the filibuster frustrate GOP efforts to repeal Obamacare, Dodd-Frank, and school choice?
It could. You know, I like the filibuster. I think it's been a good instrument for helping to protect minority interests. I worry that if it's cast aside, then when Republicans are in the minority, it will enable Democrats to do things that will have bad policy consequences. I think it's much better for Republicans to pressure those vulnerable Democrats, make the argument to those vulnerable Democrats. I'm thinking of people like Heidi Heitkamp, Joe Donnelly of Indiana, and say, look at the election results in 2016. Right. You know, these are senators who won in 2012, many of them on the coattails of Barack Obama. Barack Obama's not around anymore. If they're going to get reelected, they have to get elected on their own, and they have to get elected in a very different political environment. It's much better, in my view, to make political arguments, to make first to make a policy argument. If you believe in the things that you're talking about, make the case, try to persuade people, try to persuade the public, try to persuade these elected officials. But if you want to apply political pressure, that's a much more effective way to do it than simply changing the rules.
Very good. Appreciate you taking the time. Stephen Hayes, Weekly Standard.
Absolutely.
Have a
Thank
great
you.
rest of the trip. Thank you very much.
Thanks.